Okay, well, thanks to Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, for the introduction, the kind introduction. And first of all, thanks to the Haven Centre for Social Justice. I really said injustice. It's your social justice for your invitation. This week, I'm going to talk about the global food chain from a labour perspective. And I'm going to start the first kind of seminar/lecture with looking at hired agricultural workers. Tomorrow I'll move on to child labour, and on Friday or Thursday or Friday, whenever, I'm going to try and pull all that together, including smallholder farmers, under the rubric of sustainable agriculture. Even though I've been told that's a word in medicine that doesn't go down well, they've got to talk about integrated agricultural system. Okay, so I'm going to fire away. If you've got any burning questions, please butt in. If not, I'm going to allow plenty of time at the end for discussion. This is really a discussion. The theme is generally the great injustice that we sow it, we reap it, we can't afford to eat it. Now, you all like food, okay? Well, tell me some of your favourite foods. Chocolate. Chocolate. Where does chocolate come from? Which part of the United States does chocolate come from? Catch question. Alabama, okay. Apart from Alabama, where in the world does chocolate grow? Where would you get chocolate from?
Africa and South
Ghana.
South
America. Ghana.
All right, which are the two big producing countries in the world?
Cote d'Ivoire.
Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Okay. Some other favourite food. Think a bit outside of medicine. Come on, guys.
Bananas.
Bananas. Okay, you don't grow bananas in medicine, right? Where do you grow?
Colombia.
And where else?
Ecuador. Ecuador.
Ecuador. Okay. What about some other foods?
Coffee.
Okay. All over. All over. Yeah. Okay. The point I'm making is, in one way or the other, we are actually intimately connected with agriculture every day of our lives. It's as simple as that. We often don't think about it because there's a lot of things we don't do every day, but one thing we do is we eat and we drink. So what do we know about the people who produce our cocoa, coffee, even if it's in Alabama? Okay? What do we know about them? What do we know about the global agricultural workforce? All right, a question. How many people globally produce our food? How many women and men, and sometimes younger persons, in all countries around the world, produce the cocoa, the coffee, the wheat, whatever it is? How many? Any ideas? Any suggestions? What do you know about the workers? It's dead silence. All right, I'm going to give you 4 options. 500 million, 800 million, 1 billion, 1.3 billion.
1.1 billion.
Okay. Any offers apart from 1.3 billion?
1 billion.
1 billion. Okay, that'll do. Pretty good. Pretty good. If you listen to the United Nations International Labour Organization, you've got just a billion workers. This is hired workers and farmers. If you listen to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Bank, they put it slightly higher, 1.3 billion. These are estimates, don't take them too seriously, but these are ballpark figures. The data is not good, but that's an estimate. The point is that this is over 1/3 of all workers in the world. This is still the single largest workforce. The services sector is reckoned to be bigger, but it's actually broken up into many different occupations. This is the largest single workforce. You've got a large number of women workers. This is women farmers, women hired workers. They dominate. This is a workforce where women are often dominant. It's one of the very few workforces where there are more women than men, even though they still get monthly pay. And you've got things like migrant workers. And the point about these workers, is it better if I stand for your video over here? Is that going to happen?
It's fine.
The point about these workers is that these are the workers who are at the very heart of the global food chain. And they're the ones, as we say in the jargon, who produce the goods, to produce the food, the commodities, from plough to plate, from field to fork. Just very briefly, the importance of agriculture. Maybe less important in the US, but in Asia you've got 700 million agricultural workers. 70% of all agricultural workers in the world, and they're responsible for 62%. I'll let you read the figures yourself. I don't know about North America. But what you can see from this is that agriculture is still very important in terms of numbers of employed and the income it generates to feed themselves and the families, send the children to school and the like. It's still a very critical industry. If I'm going too fast or you want to slow up, please let me know, okay? Right, the figures. Hired agricultural workers. Are people happy with the word hired? Employed? Waged? In other words, they are not farmers.
Right.
These are hired workers. They work for someone else. They work for some form of wage. We estimate 300 to 400 million, so 40% if it's a billion, slightly less if your maths are better than mine, if it's 1.3 billion, okay? 85% of all farmers, the rest, are smallholders. They farm less than 2 hectares. 5 acres, I think, is the interpretation. A lot of them are farming less than a hectare. They've got to feed themselves, the families, send the kids to school, do all the other things they have to do on that. That is their livelihood. That's their sustainability. Together they feed the world, and they feed the world every day. What would it, 6 billion, the world population is going to go up to 9 billion. And this is the social injustice, and I'll just let you read it for a minute. Okay? They feed us, they can't feed themselves. They can't clothe themselves properly, their accommodation is often poor, and when you want to get your child to school, they don't have enough money even to pay the school fees if the education is not free, or even to buy the school uniforms. Bear in mind, many of the schools are a long way, and you don't get the number 80 bus circulating around to take you to the campus. Okay? That's a luxury you have to export. We're talking about a social injustice. It needs remedying. So let's go into more detail of the workers, and then we'll move on to look at the solutions and some solutions and recommendations for discussion about what you can do. They're part of the core poor, the world's core poor. So it's reckoned that there are about 800, somewhere around about 805 chronically nourished people. Most of those will be in some form of agricultural work or in the rural communities. That's where the real poverty is. That's where the core poverty is. There's core poverty in urban areas, but a lot of the poor are out in the sticks. Do you use that expression? Mm-hmm. Out in the sticks, a long way from the towns and the cities. And the point is they're suffering from undernourishment, they're suffering from hunger throughout the year, and in fact you get this larger figure of 2.1 billion persons living in rural areas in absolute poverty, the $2 a day threshold. You may see slightly different figures, don't worry too much. The point is there's a lot of them and they're poor. The data is not good. So far so good? Okay? Let's crash on. Now they do a lot more than just do feed us. I just wanted to quickly say, okay, you've got the crops they produce, the commodities they produce, but they're also agricultural workers and farmers help with food security. Their own food security, but our food security, to make sure we're fed and your children are fed. Food safety, big issue. Yeah? Big issue. Every country in the world. Environmental protection, who protects the environment? Who actually created a lot of the landscape in Minnesota, in Wisconsin? Well, the answer is farmers and their agricultural workers. So you've got this whole area. Climate change mitigation. Laura will be telling us about experiences in New York. But centrally involved in agriculture is one of the main reasons why you've got climate change, or bad agriculture. And workers and farmers are actually involved in the mitigation. And the whole issue of sustainable agriculture, rural development, and the whole business of rural communities. We can pick some of these points up in discussion, okay? I'm going to rush through them. Right. For both groups, the hired workers and the farm workers, you've got human rights are basically weak or missing. Because now we're going to put this into a human rights context. Labour rights and conditions as a human right. Widespread exploitation, no decent work. This is a jargon word used by the International Labour Organization. I'll explain it later. Forced labour, trafficking. Anyone tell me what forced labour is? What's forced labour? What's trafficking? Hmm? Well, if I was using you as a forced labourer, what would you be doing? Sitting in the chair? Thank you. What would you be doing? You'd be working you're a slave. Forced labour is slavery. Okay? It still exists in this world today, and it's growing. This is the bad news, guys. What about trafficking? What's trafficking? You should know because your government does a lot on it. To counter it, I should say. Okay.
The movement of people.
Well, it's someone moving you against your will. Right? I move you from country A to country B to do whatever.
Is it necessarily against the will, or is it just under the outside of the legal?
No, so it's force.
Okay.
Yeah, or you've been tricked. We'll come into it later on. We'll pick it up. Things like the right to food. I'm going to explain what this means later on. Right to food. This is a big new international concept, a new human right that's evolved following the 2008-2009 food crisis. Food security, you're probably all familiar with. Global food security, a big issue. And there's a general need to promote the workers' right to food in the context of worker labour rights, the framework, the larger framework, and we link it to food security, link it to poverty elimination. Is this about the right speed? Are you okay on this? Yeah? All right, fine. Now, I want to concentrate on hired workers at the first lecture. There's a lot of reasons, but the reason I want to do this is I'm not in any way saying that agricultural workers have worse conditions than smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers are also exploited. But my experience of doing this work for nearly 24 years now is that when you talk about farm workers, hired workers, they are largely invisible to and ignored by policymakers, decision makers in governments, all these organisations. They don't exist. Let me give you an example. In 1992, there was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit. Does anyone know what was the two conventions that were negotiated at the Earth Summit? Thank you. The Climate Change Convention, which Laura was going to say on the tip of her tongue, the Biodiversity Convention, and Agenda 21. Have people heard of Agenda 21? Yeah? The blueprint for sustainable economic and social development in the 21st century. Look at chapter 14, Sustainable Agriculture and Rural Development. It will tell you the main actors in producing our food. Farmers, church workers, NGOs, a long list. But the word hired agricultural workers is completely missing. We decided to put this right as trade unions and labour activists. And that's what I'm going to now talk about. So I'm going to just give you some background information now on hired agricultural workers. We've already mentioned the figure 3 to 400 million. They're different from farmers. They don't own tools, they don't own their equipment, and more important, they don't own or rent land. Some often describe them as landless workers. So they're a group who are distinct from farmers. Now these people have workers that are on everything from large plantations, commercial farms to smallholder family type farms. There are active labor, smallholder farming has active labour markets all over the world. They hire workers, to plant and to sow very actively. The labour markets are very active in Africa and Asia. So it's not just large commercial farms. It's not necessarily large plantations, just large plantations. It's a wider range of farms. Right. Now, when you're dealing with conditions in terms of employment, you've got a very wide variety. You get lots of overlap, you get lots of strange overlapping words. But we're talking about permanent, full-time, temporary, casual, seasoned, daily workers. But the truth is that rural occupations are often difficult to categorise. They do overlap so much. And there's very little data. Most countries will have some form of recording data for industrial and commercial workers. When you get to agriculture, it's often not there. There isn't simply a system. They don't know how many. They might have a vague idea of the number of farmers. They have no idea of the number of hired workers. There really isn't the data. And this is in quite advanced countries, believe you me. You go to Thailand, which is not a poor country like Malawi, they don't know. Even if they wanted to know, they simply don't. So You simply don't know quite. Is the answer. Now they work for some kind of wage. Now this may be a monetary wage, US dollars, Malawi kwacha, Thai bahts, whatever, or they may receive some form of in-kind payment. Are people happy with the term in-kind payment? You know, that you get something like firewood, you get fuel, you get part of the food from the farm or whatever. So something concrete. Or maybe it's calculated in terms of rent. Now they work in an employment relation with the plantation company, farmer or labour contractor. The words employment relationship are very critical at the international level. This is a concept you need to get in your head. The International Labour Organization is a tripartite organisation. It has an almost permanent committee on determining the employment relationship. Why? Because we have an enormous problem in industries like agriculture of hidden, undeclared work, especially with migrant workers, workers supplied by labour contractors. And what that means is, again, usually as an example, I come along and say, as an outside person, and I say, who do you work for? And you say, myself. And you're working as part of a gang, and you're clearly not working for yourself. In other words, you're claiming to be self-employed, or the labour contractor is employing you. You say, oh, look, I'm the labour contractor. You're all self-employed. I tell you what to do, and I cut your wages when I want to. This is an enormous problem. Agriculture is one of the classic areas, like construction, where you get undeclared work. It's a big issue. So the employment relationship, we can pick it up in questioning. Something important to remember as a term. It's a big, big issue internationally, and in labour areas generally. Now, I mentioned that you've got a growing number of women working as hired workers. There's a strong feminisation of the hired workforce. More and more women are actually taking waged employment, and you've got problems like discrimination, lack of gender equality, and so on and so forth. And the whole problem is you've got increasing casualisation, flexibilisation, outsourcing. Are people happy with the word outsourcing? Anyone tell me what outsourcing is? I'm a company. I'm a big major national company. All right, let's take a concrete example. I'm one of the Indian tea corporations. I'm the Tata Tea Corporation in India. I've got thousands of workers on the plantations, sometimes tens of thousands. I decide to outsource my production. What am I doing?
Contracting it out.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Different companies doing the manufacturing.
You're no longer, Tata are no longer going to say they produce the tea. They will create a company, or they will sell the right. When you stay in many of the hotel chains, like Hilton, it's not Hilton who run the hotels. That's just the brand name. The hotels are run by a separate company. This is now happening in agriculture. Crops like tea, crops like bananas. You may see the labels like Chiquita. It will no longer be produced on a Chiquita owned or run plantation. And it makes it much more difficult to control labour conditions once this happens. This is a good way. This cuts costs. And I'll tell you more about the Indian situation where there's literally people starving to death on the tea plantations as a result of outsourcing. So we've got vulnerable exploited workers. We've also got child labour. I'll come on to it. Migrant labour. This is the area of huge expansion. This is the big change. The European Union has, to grow its crops, every year has 500,000 migrant workers. Every year, 1 million Indonesian workers go to Malaysia to work. Every year, 1 million. Costa Rica gets all the workers from Nicaragua to deal with its bananas. Kyrgyzstan, the workers go to Kazakhstan to harvest the tobacco. The world's become, migrant labour is now a big, big fact. And food and commodity chains now really do depend on migrant labour. And you can imagine the conditions for migrant labour are often poor. The word exploitation is often associated, not always, but in large part. I mentioned slavery, forced labour, trafficking. These guys are criminally organised. In Brazil, in 2004, when the labour inspectors, the Brazilian labour inspectors, were going to inspect forced labour on farms in northern Brazil, 3 of them and their driver were assassinated by gunmen hired by the local landlords. And as a result of that, the Brazilian government, labour inspection, has now set up a mobile flying squad. If you were a Brazilian labour inspector recruited in the north to deal with forced labour on farms, You would not be allowed, you were recruited from a different part of Brazil. Your family would not be allowed to be with you. You would go in armed convoys with federal police with orders to shoot. Okay? That's happening today. The Brazilian labour inspectors have just gone over to Thailand to apparently help them set up a mobile flying squad for agriculture and fishing. I can't see the Thai people doing the same. They're not the same mentality.
What are they shooting at? What's the purpose of the flying?
Well, basically the landowners. The landowners have actually been shooting them to keep them from doing their job as labour inspectors. Checking on the, in other words, there was slave labour on the farms in northern Brazil. The labour inspectors were going in to deal with that. They were assassinated. They were actually quite cynically ambushed. It's one of the big scandals in 2004. The same year, 2 French labour inspectors were checking migrant workers in the south of France. They were killed by the farmers. They shot them dead, including a woman labour inspector. Okay? All right? I've just lost my way a bit, sorry. I'm just... Do I need you back, Richard? Why it's not clicking back? Well, I want to just go to where I am.
Others?
Okay, yeah, that's it. Fine, thanks. Okay. Is he on there?
One more. They're going up or a little bit?
Oh, it's just, yeah. Okay. You may have heard of this guy. Guy called Obama. Okay. You do a lot of work on trafficking, and I'll talk about that more as we go on. You have something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. It's really important internationally. I'll give you some examples. This piece of legislation. This is one of the great things the US does, and all credit to it as a nation. These are where you get forced labour, adult forced labour, child forced labour, and this is what the list that the US government makes up to actually say none of these goods produced under conditions of forced labour can be imported into this country. They've just downgraded. They have 4 tiers, and this year they've just downgraded Thailand, where I've been doing a lot of work because of exploitation in the fishing industry. And I do a lot of work on fishing, migrant workers in the fishing industry in Thailand. And believe you me, it's cowboy country. It really is. So this has been downgraded. That means Thailand's exports, 6 billion exports of shrimps and fish to the USA will be injured, will be harmed. Now what I want to do is just talk a bit more about the problems that agricultural workers face. But I also want to then help you learn about the International Labour Organization and how it structures its work. And the ILO has a program. Everyone familiar with the International Labour Organization, part of the United Nations? Let me ask you a question first of all. 100 years ago, the World War was in place. World War I was in place. What was the treaty that finished World War I? What was it called? Where did it take place?
Treaty of Versailles.
Thank you. Who was the American president who was instrumental in the Treaty of Versailles?
Wilson.
Thank you. What was the international body that was set up to control world peace and stability coming out of the League of Nations? What was one of the first organizations ever founded by the League of Nations?
The ILO.
Thank you. Which year? 1919. It is the oldest surviving part of the United Nations. It was set up in 1919. The truth is it was set up because of the Bolshevik Revolution. They won't tell you that, but that's the truth. They got worried. They thought, whoops, we better do something here. And the ILO works under the broad umbrella of decent work, and it has what it calls 4 pillars of decent work. I'm going to run through each pillar in relation to... Okay? The pillar's getting stronger. Okay? Let's pick up a few of the points. Agricultural workers, hired agricultural workers, are often exempt from basic laws. There's basic laws protecting other workers. It's as simple as that. You go to a place like Thailand, Thailand's a fairly developed country, and until very recently, agricultural workers in fishing were completely exempted from the labour code. They were simply covered. So there was no regulation or enforcement. And we still can't even work out whether they're now covered, because one person says one thing, one person says another. We never see it in writing. But there's a basic problem of exemption. Lack of freedom of association. What is freedom of association? Someone tell me. If you say poor freedom of association, what does that mean?
Organizing labor.
Hmm?
Organizing union.
Yeah, right. But in what way? You can't organise a labor
You
union.
cannot.
Right. You're not. In other words, you're blocked. It also also means not just labour unions, but also smallholder farmer organisations. In other words, you're not allowed to freely associate and form your own associations to promote your labour rights and conditions and working conditions. Okay?
Like in
True
Wisconsin.
here.
Like in Wisconsin, and like in Ontario, Canada. Okay? It comes close to home. We'll come back to Wisconsin in a minute. All right? Pick that up point in your questioning. I'd be interested to hear about that. Okay. Collective bargaining. What's collective bargaining? Trade unions collective. I call them trade unions, you call them labour unions. Trade unions collectively bargain. What does that mean?
Contract on behalf of the workers and the employer.
Yeah, so what happens? You're on a big banana plantation. You're going to do collective bargaining. What's happening?
If there's a union, the union bargains with the...
Collective bargaining will only happen where you've got a union.
Right,
Yeah, okay? So they're going to be bargaining with,
the employer.
on what? Give me some
Terms of
examples.
conditions, wages, hours, working conditions.
Yeah, okay. Collective bargaining, different from individual bargaining. If you go and try and negotiate a pay rise with your boss, that's your business. It's not collective bargaining. I think some of the other points are pretty okay, but the point is really there are a lot of problems in the area. And one thing about when you're dealing with supply chains, agriculture supply chains are very long. There's lots of producers. Lots of time, when you've got 85% of smallholders they're producing for supply chains, and when 85% of all your farmers are smallholders, 2 acres, you've got very long supply chains. It does make it more problematic, but it's still possible. Any other questions on this before I flick? We can come back to these in discussion time, yeah? Right, that's pillar 1. Okay, so we propped up 1/4 of the building.
Meaning you have to have those protections to be considered pillar 1?
No, I'm just giving some examples of problems in relation to agricultural workers. Yeah, there could be for other workers there could well be other problems. Yeah, but those are some of the ones particularly. Sorry, Richard.
Go back, Bill.
Just back.
Decent work means work under strong labor rights.
Right.
It's a positive. These are showing there's work. These are weak
Right.
pillars.
Yeah.
They're pillars around.
The idea of decent work, the previous Director General was a guy called Juan Sombavia, and he's a Chilean. And he came in and he said, right, we've got to put labour issues on the map, because it wasn't necessarily the forefront. And he was good, and he came up with the ILO team with the concept of decent work. So every worker, whether they're an employed worker or a self-employed worker, has the right to decent work. And then decent work, means a whole bunch of things: good pay, decent hours of work, gender equality, a whole bunch of things. And it's sort of broken down into 4 pillars. And this links to the sort of broad 4 areas of work of the ILO. And the ILO's primary job, just to take a step back, is obviously labour rights and standards. What's the main instrument? What's the main standards that the ILO negotiates? ILO
Pensions.
Thank you. Conventions. The ILO is there to do. All right, let's take a step back. The ILO is a tripartite organisation. What does that mean?
3 parts.
All right. Let me give you another illustration. The ILO is based in Geneva, and it was formed in 1919, and as it was one of the first United organisations, they got the best location on Lac Léman, Lake Geneva. Okay. It's now been taken over by those people called the World Trade Organization. All right? But if you go to the World Trade Organization, which was formed at the ILO, the gate, the huge ceremonial gate, has 3 keys. Why? 3 locks, 3 keys. Why? Who do the 3 keys represent? Key 1.
Government, labor,
Thank
and
you.
capital.
Government,
Labor and capital.
labour, and when you say capital, could you?
Business.
Employers. It's tripartite. Right? Government, employers, workers. Yeah? When you negotiate a convention on whatever subject, forced labour, whatever, for that convention to be adopted, what has to happen? Does anyone know? At the end of the negotiation, 2 years of negotiating the Convention on Safety and Health in Agriculture, which I did for 2 years, 4 years actually, because I did all the background. On the final day, you're in the plenary. To make that convention come to life, you're the government, you're the workers, you're the employers. What do you have to do? Think of pressing a button.
Agree.
No? You have to, thank you. You have to vote. This is the only organisation in the world where workers have a vote. This is the only organisation in the world where employers have a vote. Okay? If Bill Gates was, if we sent Bill Gates to the FAO in Rome, he'd have to sit there as an observer. Okay? Even with all his money. He doesn't have a right to vote. A worker who goes to the FAO in Rome doesn't have a right to vote. The only place workers and employers have any right to vote in the world, internationally, is in the International Labour Organization. That's the basis on which it was set up. That's why it's important. Okay? So far, so good? So the second pillar, as you would expect, employment, the big issue. So let's look at some of the deficits. The jargon word here we're looking at now is called decent work deficits, things that are not there that should be. So we're looking at the negative. We're going to come on to the solutions in a minute. Seasonal casual labour, replacing permanent employment, outsourcing. This is a big problem. So in other words, you're moving away from permanent work, you're getting into this outsourcing, casualisation, temporary contract, zero contract. It's getting to be a world where it's even more difficult to ensure any form of decent labour protection. I don't have to tell you, agriculture is associated with the idea of cheap, low wages, cheap labour. And I gave some background reading for the thing, and we can pick up some of the examples, plenty of examples of low wages, but basically low wages, not only low wages, but wages that are often not even paid regularly. You know, you get a wage check, every week, every month, sometimes 6 months to get paid. What do you do? How do you feed your family in between? Is the local storekeeper going to give you credit? And if so, do you have to take out, many agricultural workers have to take out loans at exorbitant rates from money lenders to survive. It's a crazy system. No written contracts of employment. Mentioned undeclared hidden work, we can come back to that. Labour contracting is a big, big issue. And there's an issue of something called gangmasters. I come from, you can probably tell from my accent, I come from a place called the United Kingdom, okay? And in 2004, a gangmaster, a labour contractor, was using migrant Chinese labour to pick shellfish on the shores of the county I come from, Lancashire, on the seashore. The tides were notorious in the area that there was the migrant workers were working. The gangmaster didn't know anything, hadn't organised them. 23 Chinese workers, men and women, were drowned to death. The tide came in, 23 workers. He created the biggest scandal ever, quite rightly, and the UK government introduced the gangmaster legislation. Labour contractors in agriculture and other areas have to register with the government, have very strict criteria, and there is now a very strict enforcement. 2004, my own country, 23 workers. It happens even in the so-called industrialised developed world. It's not just a developing country problem. I mentioned feminisation of the workforce. Obviously, you then get the whole issue of employment rights for women and the particular areas you have to look at, discrimination, harassment, equal pay and the like. Migrant labour, again, comes in here. I've mentioned here ministers of agriculture stronger than ministers of labour. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say we go to an agriculturally based economy, a country. We move from here, we go to somewhere in Asia or Africa. We're looking at the Ministry of Agriculture, and we're looking at the Ministry of Labour. Which do you think is the larger building?
Ag.
Thank you. Because agriculture is dominant. This is where they earn their export revenue, the dollars, the greenback dollars. The Ministry of Agriculture is bigger, it's got staff, it's got, in relative terms, resources. The Ministry of Labour's, I can take you to some of them, boy oh boy. I tell you, even my house is cleaner than some of those, and my house is pretty rough. The ministers of Labour really are often way down the pecking order. So they don't have the clout, if that's a word you use, the clout. They don't have the leverage. And the fact is that the Ministry of Agriculture, and they often don't have the mandate from their own governments to deal with rural areas. So the Ministry of Agriculture go out, deal with farmers. They should deal with hired workers, but they don't. Okay, it's not even in the mandate of the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of the thing. So if you're the ILO and you want to get to the Ministry of Agriculture on child labour, we've had to learn to work with the Ministry of Agriculture and through the FAO. It's as simple as that. Otherwise, we're never going to get to reach where the child labour is. And my opinion is the ILO will never deal properly with agricultural workers. That's why we've started to build coalitions with the FAO and other bodies on child labour and other issues, which I'll talk about in question time. Okay, so good? Pillar 3, social protection. Now there's various elements to social protection, but I'll just talk about the main one. Agriculture is one of the 3 most dangerous sectors. What are the other 2? This is in terms of fatalities, injuries, occupational disease. Extractive industries. Give me an example. Mining is the other one. What's the other big one?
Fishing.
Fishing, all right, we'll add a 4th one. We'll call it fishing. Okay? What's another one?
Construction.
Okay, you got it. Now, these are estimates. This is the international labour. These are guesstimates, okay? That's all they are, but they're reasonable. There's an estimated 355,000 workers who die every year. Workers who go out of the door in the morning and never return home alive. Okay? This is slaughter. And it's avoidable slaughter. That's the point about this. 50% happen in agriculture, but you never hit the headlines. Mining disaster in Chile. Do you remember the miners who were trapped in Chile? Mining disaster, fire in Bangladesh in the Rana Plaza textile workers, the building collapse fire. It hits the headlines. Agriculture, dead worker here, dead worker there. It doesn't hit the headlines. It's very local, so people don't realise it. Now, in addition, you get about something like 270 million occupational diseases. Farmers and agricultural workers are in there. They're in there. We don't know how. The data simply isn't good enough. 160 million cases of occupational disease. These are the figures.
Pesticides.
Yeah, things like that. Well, it's everything. What's the most common occupational disease in agriculture? Occupational disease. What's the most common one?
Lung cancer.
Asthma. Why? You breathe in dust, no protection. It's the most, farmers around the world have higher rates of occupational asthma than the general population. So, there's no disease reporting systems, occupational safety and health risk assessment. I do a lot of that around the world, especially with smallholder farmers, missing. These are some of the things. We can pick this up in question time and discussion time, okay? But these are some of the things. The point is, this is a dangerous sector to work in. And I am also a former labour inspector. I'm also a former health and safety labour inspector in agriculture. I used to go to farms and enforce legislation on behalf of Her Majesty's government. Okay? So, other forms of social protection. And that's what this means. No health insurance, medical care, sickness and maternity benefits. And I hear from reading the internet today that Walmart is now going to lower its health insurance for workers who work less than 30 hours a week. Okay? They are going to decrease their health insurance. Now it's very strange because the working week in Europe is 38 hours. And they're saying under 30 hours is part-time work. Well, it's a pretty serious part-time work, don't you think? But you've got these same problems here. But in this case, this is the agricultural workers. You often go onto plantations and you'll see older people just on the plantations. That's where they work, that's where they're going to retire and die. And they live in the local house and they've got no benefit. They depend on the community to feed them. and often the generosity of the farming employer. They've got no pensions. Simple as that. Obviously, housing, living conditions often poor. Some of the plantations and places I go to, are, even on the larger plantations, then the conditions are not good. Overcrowded where they work. You go to Joburg in South Africa, you go to one of the most developed capitals in the world, masses of luxury. You go 50 kilometres from Joburg, you'll find 1,500 workers living under plastic sheets on farms with big tractors and overhead power cables. 50 kilometres from Joburg. In the city's luxury, 50 kilometres away. Bad conditions. The last pillar, social dialogue. Basically, the voice of labour trade unions is often poorly heard. They're not part of national dialogues, especially hired workers and even smallholder farmers. You have to remember with smallholder farmers that larger farmers often want to take them over. Okay? They don't want them in dialogue. The larger farms often get the voice and the agricultural workers often don't get around the table. So promoting social dialogue is a big area. Okay? Let's do quickly for the last 10 minutes before we move to discussion, solutions, recommendations, and please come in here. If you've got any further solutions or questions, now we can really start to move in. You've got some of the hopefully some of the basic information. Now I'm drawing very heavily from experience. I worked for the International Union of Food Agriculture Workers, which is the agricultural trade union, the global trade union federation that organises workers in the food chain. It organises workers in the food industry, Nestle, Coca-Cola, the hotels, the catering restaurant. It also is the one that organises the agricultural workers. I worked for them for 5 years in addition to the ILO. So I'm basing this on that. And I'm also basing this on work that comes out of something called the United Nations Right to Food, and also the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the Ruggie Principles. I don't know if you've heard of these, but these are the new principles that are now trying to set standards and improve the situations for hired workers and other groups of exploited workers. Right, the right to food. In 2008, we had the food crisis. Do people remember that? All of a sudden, not enough food. The sudden discovery that all the food storage had been privatised and therefore there wasn't enough to feed people. And we had it in 2009. And a lot of the problems in agriculture, the chronic underinvestment in agriculture for decades came to light. And as a result, the United Nations set up a special rapporteur on the right to food. Mike, you met him. Or you listened to him, should we say.
Mm-hmm.
He came to Wisconsin
He
when?
was here last year.
Do you want to just tell the people about it?
His name is Olivier de Schutter.
Yeah.
He was here in Madison last year giving a speak at the concourse, the big hotel, part of a larger symposium. I don't know if anyone was there. It was very interesting. It was a very broad discussion on agriculture and sustainable issues in face of climate change.
Okay, and basically the right to food applies to obviously, all people on the planet, but in particular, Oliver, the special reporter and his team have been able to focus on agricultural workers. And a lot of the demands that we were making as trade unions have now been incorporated in the whole package of right to food. It's been a big step forward because that gets you more centrally into the UN, yeah? This is the importance. So the right to food has become a big sort of vehicle for promoting... Can
you go back for a second?
Yeah, sure.
That second bullet point.
Hang on.
Okay.
Yep.
Therefore not to be interpreted in narrow or restrictive sense, which equates it with a minimum package of calories, proteins, or other specific nutrients.
That's the definition. I didn't write it.
No, what I mean by that is that in reaction to the attempts to do that?
Say that one again.
Is that in there because the opponents
Well, so let me give you an illustration. Sometimes you get feeding on plantations and stuff, but
Right.
it's not very good quality.
Right.
That's the truth of the matter. Yeah, so it's got to be nutritive. You sometimes get feed, even plantation workers sometimes get fed, but it's actually not very good quality food. That's the point. So, and some of the obligations that come from this, again, for states, agricultural employers, the point is there's now a structure being put in place to say states, governments have these obligations which we know about. but also placing duties, in this case, on agricultural employers, saying they've got to respect the right to food, guarantee it. It's no longer for them just to say employment, they've got to make sure that the workers they employ have a right to food or adequately fed. Yeah? They have, so if it was a larger company that they've got canteen facilities or some means of most of the time when I was a labour inspector in the UK in the middle of winter, the agricultural workers' canteen is the sack in the barn. That was the canteen. And you can imagine the conditions when you get to some of the other countries, but especially the focus on agribusiness. Yeah? They have a responsibility to respect the right to food. Again, in their supply chain, market sourcing, pricing, waging, including their subsidiaries.
I'm sorry, so when you talk about these rights and obligations, this is in the UN policies that's been developed? That you have, that the governments sign on to? Or just proposals?
These are proposals.
Yeah.
These are proposals. This isn't sort of necessarily agreed text, but the point is, this is now the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Food who reports direct to the UN Secretary General who's saying this. Now the truth is we fed him a lot of this. That's, I say we, you know. He got fed a lot of this, but he was very good. He picked it all up, the stuff we've been saying for years. And he said, hey, yeah, we'll run with it. But the point is it gets you in at a high level. In other words, the collective bargaining that has to take place, you can do at a high level. You've got more levers. Because this is all about power. This is all about changing power relationships. This is what we're in the business of. Yeah? This gets you at a high level. So that's one area. These are some general obligations now that I'm going to put forward as recommendations. Okay? Sorry, it should say recommendations rather than obligations. These are some proposals, and they, again, they've come out from bodies like IUF, working with NGOs, a whole range of organisations which are trying to promote better standards in agriculture. This is some collective thinking. And so I'm just doing a summary just as a basis for discussion. Okay, secure the workers' rights, this is the big issue. Extend the laws, it's a simple demand. It hasn't happened. The very first ILO convention on agriculture was in 1921. We're still having this discussion. No, I'm bad at maths, but 21 to 14, we're getting on for a century, okay? We still haven't got the basic rights. Guarantee the basic freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining. It still isn't there. Legally able to organise the capacity that trade unions are legally able to organise, because they're often stopped from doing that. Migrant workers in many countries are not allowed to join trade unions. In Thailand, they're not allowed to join trade unions, and they're certainly not allowed to stand for leadership roles, even if they are allowed to join a national trade union. There are legal bans on them. Policies, minimum wage legislation. Okay? We can come back to these in a minute. Let me just run through them, and then we can come back to them in the discussion. Promote safe and healthy workplaces. Carry out risk assessments. And this is an important one. In 2002, the negotiations, the ILO negotiations on the Convention on Safety and Health Agriculture, because this was one of the 3 most dangerous industries. So it was felt that it should have its own convention. The employers were vigorously opposed, and one of the things that was put in, it was finally secured in the convention, was the right of workers to select their own workplace safety and health reps. In many countries, the safety and health reps, if they exist, are appointed by the employer. Okay? So, I'm the employer and I say, you're the safety and health rep. And you're the workers. Okay? I appoint your health and safety rep. It doesn't work. So this is a big area. And I'll give you some more examples of this in discussion. So, social security extended. Obviously, women workers, migrant workers have equal employment, promotion rights, provide strict penalties in the cases of forced labour trafficking. These are criminally organised gangs in many cases, and they're rough gangs, and they're prepared to kill. They're actually prepared to kill. Oops, so lazy. I missed the one. This is the transnational companies. This again drawing heavily on something called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights and Business, the Ruggie Principles. That businesses must respect human rights, including addressing human rights violations with which their subsidiary companies. This is often the problem when you're dealing with companies. They often say, well, actually, yeah, sure, on my plantation and my farming company, yeah, we've got it. But we're not responsible for down the chain. You're the smallholder farmers of land. We're not responsible for you guys. You know, you do what you like. We've got no legal responsibility. It's the big, big issue, the big, big discussion issue. And always, you know, my experience is they will say, hey, we've no legal obligation. These are now saying they've got to move, they've got to take responsibility down the chain. That's the significant shift. That's why these things are important, because it moves the debate on. It doesn't mean it's solved, of course it doesn't, but it moves the debate to where it should be, in the supply chain. Because quite honestly, on child labour, the big companies have learned. When I started on child labour many, many years ago, you go on plantations, you'd find bad conditions. You go on a big plantation, almost anywhere in the world, you won't find child labour. We pushed it down the line. I'll take you to the oil palm rubber plantations in Ghana, Unilever. They run it well. They run it well. All credit to them. They've got their act together. You won't find child labour. You'll find even pretty good health and safety conditions. They've got their act together. Companies learn. But then when you go down the smallholder farmers, half the production, half the stuff they put, oil palm they put through the mill, is supplied by the smallholders. You go onto the smallholder farms, what do you find? The kids. And the farmers say to us, 60% of the labour we use on our farms is child labour. Help us to get rid of it. They want to get rid of it. They want to send the kids to school. They don't want to exploit the kids. So, using influence on suppliers to ensure wages and working conditions improve, seeking to conclude global framework agreements, and I can explain that in question time, supporting government labour inspection. This is one of the big areas. I mentioned I'm a former labour inspector, and on behalf of the ILO, I've actually put all together, I've written the 2 training manuals on labour inspection in rural areas, and worked with colleagues. And the conclusion is, when you come to rural areas, labour inspection either simply does not exist or doesn't work. Simple as that. It doesn't work. There's no one goes into the rural areas and actually do what happens in factories and workshops. So if you want to check on decent health and safety conditions, you want to check the wages are paid, then government labour inspection is going to have to be put back in place. And the whole business of ensuring standards in supply chain with their suppliers. This big shift to sort of say suppliers have got to have the same standards. You can't outsource and say, oh, well, you know, I'm getting my stuff from this place and that place and I have no responsibility. Okay. I think that's a good place for me to stop. I've gone on a bit longer than I thought I would, but I hope that gives you some background for the discussion. Now, I appreciate I've got through a lot of things quickly, but any points that people now want to pick up, any contributions people want to make? We've got half an hour, I think.
Right, we have until 5:30.
I probably forgot to say, sorry, just a moment. That's fine. Any other slides people want me to go back to?
So I don't think you've explicitly said it, but I take it what you're getting at is that the best way to resolve many of these problems would be if farm workers, agricultural workers could organize unions.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the heart of the matter.
Well, that's a very important point. I work for the trade unions. Okay, I work for the British trade unions, and I worked for the international trade unions. When you come to sectors like agriculture, construction and stuff, unions are often weak. But, you know, you've got a very scattered population. So yes, it's one of the important things is to actually help trade unions, labour unions build capacity. You go to many countries in Africa, for example, and the Agricultural Workers Union is the largest union because agriculture is the largest industry. And on the plantations, you've got some chance of organising them and helping them. But but once you get a bit more remote, it becomes very difficult. And even there, the unions are poor. You go to a country like Malawi, and I'll take you into the trade union headquarters in Malawi, the general trade union headquarters. It's like a shack. You know, I think, how can it be so poor? And these guys are there helping the women with the baby on her arm, helping her out. These are the areas where you've got to start to build. You've got to. This is about empowerment. And if you don't empower workers and you don't empower smallholder farmers, things won't change. You can do as much rhetoric as you like. They've got to have rights, and they've got to be able to use those rights and enforce them and put them into practice. And unless smallholders, agricultural producers have learned to organise. We've talked about trade unions for hired workers, but smallholder farmers are now increasingly developing production in relation to contract farming through outgrower associations. Now, let me give you an example in Tanzania, where we were working on child labour. In Tanzania, the government decided to help the smallholder farmers and have a register of outgrower associations. So you go to Kilimanjaro sugar estates, about 100 kilometres from Dar es Salaam. They've got 20,000 smallholder farmers that supply the sugar. 20,000 smallholder farmers on one sugar estate. They're organised into 2 outgrower associations. So you've got 10,000 smallholder farmers. These outgrower associations now raise their own capital. Every year they go to the local cooperative bank and raise $5 million worth of capital. They have paid accountants, they have paid managers, they have their own tractors, they have their own technicians. They're actually turning into small businesses. So they're starting to become empowered and starting to have leverage. And in fact, we were interested in them from a child labour point of view because we could get to them. They said 30, 60, 40, 50% of our workforce is child labour. Help us get rid of it. But they've got some means of doing it. In other words, in Tanzania, there's been a progressive policy to empower the smallholders. It doesn't happen in other parts of the world. You go to Malawi, or your boy. We're working with the National Association of Smallholder Farmers in Malawi. It's building, and it was set up by USAID. Okay? These are the links. So these are the type of things you're trying to do. It's a very varied picture. Empower, build the capacity so that they can actually look after their own affairs. That's the type of idea, okay?
Excuse me, just one question came to my mind when you are talking about agricultural sector compared to other sectors. I mean, in developing countries in general, labor rights are not respected in general.
Sorry, which countries? I misheard you.
I mean, in developing countries.
Sorry,
in general.
Yeah.
Labor rights are not recognized or respected, not only in agriculture, but in all other sectors. What is particular about agriculture? Agriculture usually is, the profit made by farms is very low, and it is attracting unskilled labor. So maybe the situation for labor in agriculture is worse. But in general, what do you think the difference between agricultural sector and other sectors, especially in developing countries where general...
All right. Well, let's talk about rural development more generally. One of the clear factors, and this is now moving more general, but this comes out of work by a whole bunch of people, academics, universities, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the World Bank. The general thinking is, look, agriculture needs to be diversified, and you need to encourage people to move out of agriculture into other jobs. However, and that was the dream, that was the idea, wasn't it? In the 1980s, agriculture fell out of favour internationally, and even nationally. Agricultural investment went down so low, it's unbelievable. In the sub-Saharan African countries, places like Ghana were putting back, for every $100 they took out of agriculture, they were putting back 98 cents. Okay? The working figure is that unless a country is putting at least $10 back for every $100 it earns, you're not even going to move forward. You're not going to modernise your agriculture. That's the current thinking. But the answer is that your non-farm sector, which is because people still live in rural areas, and the idea of people say, oh, let's develop the non-farm sector. The evidence says that unless your farm sector is well and buoyant, your non-farm sector will be weak. It will never get the revenue because your non-farm sector will still be agriculturally related initially. Then it can get to a take-off point where it becomes independent because a lot of the non-farm will be farm transport or whatever. And the idea that some people have of somehow, you're going to build a technology company in a remote part of Malawi, well, forget it. The electricity doesn't work, ever. Yeah? So you've got to sort of gradually build up. So it's not just agriculture, but agriculture in many of these, the thinking is that agriculture is a driver. And because there's large numbers, and because it can be profitable, if you want to drive sustainable development, poverty reduction, the recognition is now, the thinking is to start getting your agriculture modernized. We have to discuss what the hell that means. Support your smallholder farmers. Now, I hope that's true. My heart's with smallholder farmers, okay? I don't want to see the large corporations. But the reality is you have to let them build in the infrastructure to do that. That's the thinking. So that's why agriculture is important, because these are agriculture-based countries where you get these problems. That's the truth of the matter. And unless you get your agriculture moving, forget it. All the other, the recognition is all daydreams. You're going to develop all your sectors. It's not going to work. There's not enough driver. There's not enough money going to come in the country. You're going to have to generate it from there. Unless you suddenly discover a big new source of diamonds. Okay?
Yeah, going back to your ILO imagery in the League of Nations, you're saying that there are three keys, the employer, the workers, and the, what's the third one?
Governments.
Government.
You might have heard the US.
And one person said that, well, you said, what's the key to success? That somebody said they have to agree, and you said, no, they had to vote first. But what would, and if they don't agree, how could anything be accomplished? It's not the voting, it's the agreement, right?
Well, let me just give you a brief thing. And I did this from practical experience. I was in the workers group for the negotiations on the Convention on Safety and Health in Agriculture. 2 years preparation, 2 years negotiation. And what that means is, when you're negotiating the convention, you sit in Geneva in the International Labour Conference, and it's a big room, okay? The governments are in the middle, the workers are on the left, and their employers are on the right. So there'll be as many governments choose to participate as they wish, with as many people in their delegation. The workers, the employers will have probably about 30 or 40 delegates. Yeah, from different countries, they will choose it. The workers the same. Only the worker spokesman, the employer spokesman, is allowed to speak. You are not allowed to speak as a part, you have to speak through your spokesperson. The governments can intervene freely. Then you begin it. And remember, there's been lots of preparation, lots of backdoor negotiations. Yeah, okay? Because you've actually got a draft convention. That takes 2 years to draw up. And so there has to be some broad idea that you may reach consensus. The agriculture one started off with a recorded vote on the first 5 minutes. The employer said, no, we do not want a convention on safety and health in agriculture. They were outvoted by the African and Asian governments. Okay? We've done our work with the African and Asian governments. Okay? So they said, yes, we do want a convention. So, and then and basically what then happens is, once you get over those sort of hurdles, you start to reach a broad consensus. There are very few conventions which actually sort of will fall completely flat. You will then, through the governments will negotiate. A lot depends on the attitudes of governments, because the employers are quite responsive to governments. And if they realise the governments are serious and go and vote for this convention, they're going to take a different attitude.
So what employers are present there? I mean, is it these TNC, the transnational corporations, or is it further down the food chain?
No, these are employers. Let's make a distinction between companies and employers. This is an agricultural employer. An employers organisation. So this could be it could be the Wisconsin Employers Federation, which would be part of the national employers, the employers delegation. So someone from the US, and it could be from Wisconsin, would be selected by the actual representation comes through something called the International Organization of Employers. They have national affiliates in each of the countries, and they will say, right, we need 40 people to participate in this negotiation on the convention, and they have their own internal mechanism for choosing. The International Trade Union Confederation chooses its trade union delegates through the same process.
So what motivates them to be present and participate in this? I'm sorry, this is maybe a cynical question, but
I hope so. I like those.
I mean, I tend to believe there's a conflict of interest between the employers and the employees. So
I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah, and so if there's what is the sort of power dynamic that explains the presence of employers at such a...
Well, it's very interesting. Look, it's an interesting... We could spend a long time on this. Let me tell you a true story.
Better than a fake one.
This is the ILO Convention on Safety and Health in Agriculture, right? 2 weeks, this is 3 weeks convention, solid, day and night, 3 in the morning, back in the morning, and you've got all the workers' group meetings as well. It's non-stop for 3 weeks. And the employer's representative, the senior one, was a lawyer from Lesotho, okay, in Africa. And he realized they were going to lose. And he had this, dare I say it, this pickle woman, this woman farmer from Toledo in Ohio, who grew pickles. And this woman and a colleague from the UK, the poor guy, they just kept at him. They really were harassing him. They were really very good. And one day he got so fed up, he came over to the leader of the workers' delegation. He said, "I've had enough." He said, "I'm going to concede the next point." He said, "But first of all, you as the worker delegate have to make a real objection." He said, "I'm going to resist it initially and say, no, we're not going to agree to this. You've got to get on your feet and throw all the antics and tantrums. I'll concede." Okay? This is how the negotiation did. That's what he did. Leroy Trotman, a senator from Barbados, leader of the workers' delegation, said, "This is outrageous," and threw his tantrum. And then the employer said, "Okay, fine, we agree." So there's all sorts of mechanisms that are going on. I mean, some of the conventions, there's a consensus, like child labour. Child labour was a very easily negotiated. I didn't do that, but that was an easy negotiated convention because child labour gets to the heart. Which is the most widely ratified and most rapidly ratified ILO convention? The answer is the Convention on Child Labour in Agricultural Women's Forms. Virtually 99% ratification. It was passed in 1999. Some of the conventions in 1920 have 8 ratifications. Yeah. So there are all sorts of different motivations, but there are mechanisms for trying to get consensus. At the end of the day, the employers may vote no, the workers may vote no, but by the time you've reached that final plenary, you've got a pretty fair idea of the vote. Because if it's not going to work, you'll probably cancel it and move it to another year. I don't know if that gives you a flavour. They had a lot of trouble with the fishing convention and the maritime convention. They had to delay it, and that's an exploitative sector, but they got through that as well.
So after the ratification by a convention, do the countries either agree or...
No, it's not ratified. The convention is adopted through a vote of the International Labour Organization, and it's then up to the countries to freely choose whether they ratify. If you ratify an ILO convention, then what does that mean? The US ratifies an ILO convention. What does it do from a legal point of view? Yeah. What does that mean?
It agrees to enact laws that will mirror those laws.
Right. It either will create a new law to implement the convention or modify an existing law or laws. It puts it into national law. So the convention only has force in national law. It doesn't have force internationally.
And so employers might agree to go if they think their governments might be ratifying something because they want to say in it.
There are 8 fundamental conventions. All the things I've talked about here, freedom of association, link into 8 fundamental conventions, what are called the core conventions of the ILO. 8. Freedom of association, collective bargaining, no discrimination, no forced labour, no child labour. 8 conventions. How many do you think the United States of America has ratified out of 8?
0.
Child labor?
I'll say
1.
1. You said 3. Any other
I did.
others?
0.
You said 3?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
3. 3, 1. 0. Any other offers? The answer is I'm not giving you a rude sign. It's 2. Okay? They've ratified the forced labour convention, one of the forced labour conventions and the child labour convention. Your government has not ratified it. Freedom of association, collective bargaining, no discrimination, no forced labour. Now, you may wish to, I don't know the answer to why, don't ask me why, ask your legislators. All the other governments do, and they say, oh, well, we've got equivalent standards, but it sends a bad signal.
Well, they already passed the 13th Amendment, so they felt that was a safe one.
All right. If I knew what the 13th Amendment was, I'd agree with you. You'll have to tell me that one quickly after.
1865.
Oh, 1865.
End of the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
Slavery.
In the slavery.
Yeah, I saw the film.
Except,
I saw the film. I
except
saw the film.
with one exception, prisoners.
I think in the United States, the employers are comparatively more powerful than in most other countries, and correspondingly, organized labor in general is comparatively weak,
Yeah, yeah.
and that explains why we've ratified so few conventions.
And that's what was behind my question too, is that there's a balance of power that would explain why these people would be even in the room and why it would matter to them, that is in the background.
It's a complex question. I mean, if you put this in the general context of things like what's often known as corporate social responsibility, you know, companies are now increasingly want to be seen to do the right things, okay, environmentally, and increasing on labour and social issues. It's the truth of the matter. Now, does anything change?
Not very much.
Okay.
It moves
That's
the ball
what-
a little bit, and that's what was going to be my question, is the exposure side of this.
Well, look,
You were saying, how am I doing throughout the whole thing?
well, look, I'll give you my views on this.
Yes.
As someone who's been dealing with the supply chain question for many years, companies, especially when you're sitting around, then you're all dressed up, you're all sat around the table, and the companies send in their corporate social negotiators. They talk well, you know, smooth, whatever, etc. That doesn't mean, you know, the people who run the factories, the managers in the factories and the managers on the plantations actually implement things. And my opinion is, personally, in agriculture, I've always said to companies, look, you do good works. You dig a well. You build a school. You pay for a few teachers. There's a local women's institute in the village. You give them some money. There's a local soccer team. You give them shirts. You never clean up your supply chains. And the day I see a company, in my opinion, cleaning up a supply chain, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. I'm going to start whip for a start. And whether I get drunk or whatever, or swim the channel, I don't know. I don't think I'm necessarily going to, I think I might have to wait a while. It's difficult. In 2007, just let me give you a concrete example. I was organising for the ILO. Every day there's a World Day on Child Labour. This is a huge event globally. And this year it was agriculture, and I was the coordinator who had the responsibility of putting this together around the globe. And we formed an alliance with the richest supermarket chain in Switzerland called Migros. If you go to Switzerland, Migros is everywhere. It's like a Walmart, slightly better, I have to say. And the corporate social responsibility director, he said, look, I've got 2,800 suppliers. They, in turn, they've got X thousands. He said, supply chain cleaning up? He said, do me a favour. He said that in French, by the way, so he didn't quite use those words. It's difficult, even where the companies are trying. I accept that there's been a shift in some companies. The global union framework agreements I mentioned, they're an agreement between a global trade union federation, the IUF, and a company like Chiquita. And they agree that they will look at labour conditions in all parts of their operations. And what that means, for example, if there's a case of sexual harassment in a banana plantation, on a plantation, or if someone is sacked and there's a complaint, the company and the trade union will sit down and try and work it out. Was it genuine? If it's genuine, what happens? You know, was a manager at fault? Does a manager need to be sacked or disciplined? So there are mechanisms being put in place. I'm not trying to be as cynical as that, but it's a hard one. And in many cases, you then get the cowboys. I don't want to be too grim about this, but one of the worst, most exploitive industries I've come across is the fishing industry. Okay? I've been working on two things as a child. I've been working extensively on the shrimp farming and shrimp processing industry in Thailand with the ILO. I've been working with the ILO and the National Fisheries Association of Thailand on fishing, where most of the workers are migrant workers from Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. I've been out on the fishing boats. In Thailand, we know that when some of the fishing boats, certainly the workers are trafficked, the forced labour, when they can't pay the wages, the workers' contractors, they are thrown overboard or shot. Okay? With monotonous regularity. Murdered. And in 2004, 2006, just to give you an idea, there were six Thailand fishing boats with Burmese labour fishing off Indonesia. They were at sea for 35 consecutive months. 35 consecutive months. The fishing owners fell out, and they did not renew the fishing permits. That meant the boats could not dock in Indonesia to take on fresh water and supplies. They then stopped suspending the mother ships. 39 of the 6 workers died of malnutrition in the boats. 2006. They threw the bodies overboard, got back to port, the Thai police said no bodies, we can't do anything. That case is still going through the courts. That's a classic case, that's an extreme case. But the case, if you look at industries like the fishing industry, the number of cases of forced labour, trafficking, murder, etc. are legion. That's why the trafficking persons list here, that's why the United States has had to put Thailand down the list. It's given them every chance to sort of improve their act. They haven't done it. Now they're being sanctioned. And I've trained a lot of the labour inspectors, I've trained, and they're nice people, but they don't do anything. They just don't do anything. Try and get a Thai labour inspector, they're all Sawadi crop, Sawadi car, fine, but they don't actually go out and to be truthful, they've got no legal authority. Okay?
Yeah,
That's the depression. That's the worst case scenario.
earlier you contrasted Malawi with Tanzania, and you said that Tanzania, there's a lot of progressive signs, things are going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And I want to know if you could speak a little bit more about why you think that's happening. That's my first question. My second question is about transnational campaigns. That there are instances, I know there are instances in which labor or campaigns in factories, especially garment and shoe factories in developing countries, have been helped by these kind of transnational campaigns of first world activists. Have you seen similar campaigns? Can you cite a similar campaign with agricultural workers that was effective?
Okay, so the first thing is about well, there's no easy answer to why it works in one country and why it doesn't work in another. Tanzania, in my experience of the English-speaking African countries, Ghana and Tanzania have been the more progressive. I've done a lot of work in Uganda, Kenya, that, to my opinion, they're going down rather than going up. So it's a combination of things. So in Tanzania, they seem to have got better government structures, they've got the laws in place, there's more infrastructure, there's a better level of education of the government people, they're better trained to be quite useful. In Malawi, which is one of about the 10th oldest countries in the world, this is the time you plant in Malawi. This is the end of the dry season. So we went to Malawi now. It's a beautiful country, by the way. If you want to see Africa unspoiled, go to Malawi. But don't tell anyone about it. Okay? Keep it secret. You will see land, the Africa as it was, without fences, without electricity pylons. Sadly, that means all the labour is manual. So there's going to be a need to modernise agriculture and the child labour. And that's what we're trying to do. And what we're doing is we're trying to create it through youth employment. You have a group of farmers and you start on a Monday morning and say, do you employ child labour? What do you think the answer is going to be? What? No. If you say, hey guys, we're going to come in and help you create youth employment, legal for 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, how about that? Oh, by the way, we're also going to get rid of child labour while we're doing it. Okay? We're going to listen to you more positively. So that's what we're trying to do now. In Malawi, it's a different ballgame. They just have the level of resources, the way the government's organised, even the basic level of education, in my opinion, is just lower. So there's a whole bunch of factors. The employers, and sometimes it depends whether the employers organise. In Tanzania, the employers' organisations are better organised than in Malawi. So, it's a whole equation. If you're going to think things forward, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to work with employers. And you're going to have to get them on your side and work with the positive side. And recognise that, the employers are employers, but okay, some are better than others. And again, with the trade unions, let's not paint a rosy view of trade unions. Please do not. I've worked long enough in Africa. If you tell me you're going to put 250,000 into helping workers' unions in Africa, I'll calculate that in terms of, if you don't do it properly, I'll calculate that in terms of the number of televisions and new cars they buy. It will go straight to union leadership. It will never actually result in concrete improvements. You've got to be careful about this. You've got to know how to do this. It takes practice. And unfortunately, there's people out there who do know it. We say to donors, don't put big money in. Big money is you've got to know how to do it. And even then, you get ripped off. It's still not going to be 100% there. So there are difficulties. Now, your second question. which I completely forgot.
About transnational campaigns, successful examples of transnational
Well,
campaigns.
yeah, obviously. I mean, a lot of the work, what can you say about transnational campaigns? A lot of things are happening, aren't they? I mean, on the pesticide side, you've had lots of campaigns. The Berne Declaration, you've had Pesticide Action Network North America, which has highlighted things. You're now getting things around the whole area of fair trade, and I use fair trade not in a general sense. What could you always say, food and the like. So there are movements to actually increase the profile. A lot of it comes from the food side, much less on the labour side. You do have bodies like the International Labour Rights Federation here, one an NGO that is out in Thailand and other places working. They do campaigns. But again, it doesn't get the same profile. The Rana Plaza disaster now in Bangladesh, this was when the factory collapsed, 1,100 workers. The person who's been running the project, the Isle of Shrimp project in Thailand, is a Finn called Tuomo Kutaniainen. He's now going to be the chief guru for the Rana Plaza to put it all right. This is going to be big. The money's, there's now $40 million flowing in like that. They're sending the best German technology. They're going over every square centimetre of every factory to measure the cracks. Okay? The problem is the Bangladeshi factory owners do this as a part-time hobby. This is not their serious money. So if they're running these factories as a hobby, you've got problems. But cooperation with the Bangladeshi employers and the like would be critical. And it's back and forward. You know, 1 step forwards, 2 steps back, 3 steps to the side, and sometimes you fall down a hole. But with child labour, for example, it's moved forward. And I think we've got, I say we, this is a whole bunch of colleagues and people around the world. There's more profile on the hired workers now. They're not, I gave you a very bad...
There's more what?
There's more recognition.
Okay.
It's still not, I gave you a very black scenario. When we started in about end of the 90s, the FAO said, who were hired workers? How do they work on it? That means they put money in. Because that's the critical factor. Because if they don't recognise these workers exist, they don't put any money in. How are you going to get better labour rights, freedom of association, collective bargaining, decent housing and equal pay if there's no resources going in to organise the projects and activities to change this? So, you know, and a lot of it's changing hearts and minds. In child labour, it's happened. Child labour is the big issue. Come on Wednesday. I don't want to steal my thunder for Tuesday. I might say, no. Child labour is the big issue. It was started off in the 1990s. It was started by the German government. They put the initial money in. The ILO was chosen as the vehicle because it has the conventions. And in this decade, well, the last decade, there's really, the first decade was recognition. People saying, no, it's not a problem. You pass that hurdle, what do we do about it? Okay? It doesn't mean it gets solved, but at least you move the dialogue forward. But don't believe the child labour statistics. That's the other message.
So last question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's anything within the existing international human rights framework that can address these issues, the international rights of the child, human rights for economic, cultural, and social rights, or if this is something like, for example, some of these requirements you had have to come from somewhere else, new conventions, new...
No, well very briefly, I know I'm running through this, but one of the things that I say that I think has happened in terms of labour rights is that because of the right to food has emerged. And that really came out, it was there embryonic, but it came out of the food crisis. Because basically they realised that we were likely to run out of food because we were mismanaging the world food system. You know, you might have lots of this particular thing in one part of the world, but you didn't have basics. Every time you produce for export markets, you neglect staple crops. Okay? That's the trade-off, isn't it? You know, you have X amount of land, you grow that amount of land for the export staple crops. If you change the balance, then you're into a food security problem. And a lot of the food storage facilities were privatised. They went out of government hands and they weren't kept up. Or they were stocked full of luxury export items, not staples. So there wasn't the food. So there was this big move. So the right to food has been an important thing. Then there's been this whole business on what I call the Ruby principles. And this is the guiding principles on human rights and business. Increasingly, labour rights have been put within a human framework by the ILO and by other bodies. I'm giving you a very brief I'm concentrating and mentioning the word ILO more than I should because that's a shorthand. So there's a lot going on which I think is quite positive. So the human rights framework is coming, the general thing is 15 years ago people talked about labour rights. Now they say human rights which include labour rights. Look, you go for whichever way wins, don't you? Okay? If you have to bang the drum and say human rights, you say human rights. You put the things on which to latch. But there is now some positive way forward. World Food Day will be next Thursday, not this Thursday, a week on Thursday. And the IUF, which is this international trade union, along with FIAN, the human rights organisation, and the German Catholic organisation called Miseror, will be launching this new charter on this. I actually drew up a lot of the basics, so I feel I've actually borrowed it, seeing I wrote a lot of it. We'll move, that'll be a new agenda. They're going to focus on plantation workers, which are a subset of agricultural workers. Even they're not organised. If you can't organise my boss in the trade unions, the internationals, I call Ron Oswald, he said, and people used to talk about the informal sector in agriculture. He said, forget the informal sector, we can't even organise plantation workers. You know? He said, how long have we been trying? He said, we've been going to plantation workers since plantations were created and we existed. He said, if we can't organise plantation workers, don't talk about how we're going to organise informal workers. He said, we've got to go where we can get concrete organisation. You know, that's the reality. There are a lot of people exploited out there, but you're going to have some sort of concrete framework. So these are some of the frameworks that I think. And I think one of the big advances is saying to businesses, you have to deal with your suppliers. Increasing its supply chains, increasing its outsourcing. And the number of times you talk to employers and in other contexts, small negotiations, big negotiations, we're not legally responsible for our suppliers. It's the standard line. Talk to them on high workers, talk to them on child labour and supply-chain. They're not our business. Yes, our plantations are clean, our manufacturers are clean. Now, there's a different dialogue in town, isn't there? Through the United Nations, it's difficult. They can't dodge that one. You can say, hey guys, you lost that one. Come on, you move the dialogue on. So it's a better framework that I think is evolving, a more concrete framework. And it's carrot and stick.
All right. So by this stage, I usually open the windows and allow people to throw themselves out. I always say on training, we'll give you the option of suicide in the first few hours before we try and be too cheerful. You can do things. And I'm giving you a pretty sort of flavour, but these are some of the things that I think are realities and I've lived and still live. I mean, I'm a retired guy, so I think, hey, should I be doing all this? But I still feel very passionate about help. I've spent my life trying to help agricultural workers and smallholder farmers. That's the choice I made. I'm glad I made the choice. They're a great bunch of people, an enormously talented bunch of people. Amazing. They're always cheerful. You go to Africa, you're thinking like this, it's Monday morning, you think like this. They're always bloody cheerful. I can't get over it. If they stay cheerful, I stay cheerful. Okay? So we do the same. Okay? Thanks very much for your attention.